Welcome. My name is Sally Allen. I'm the co-president of the League of Women Voters of the Ann Arbor area. And I welcome you tonight on a very important topic. I'm sure that all of you have been reading articles in the newspaper and on the internet about what's going on. There have been a lot of articles in the past week. So this presentation tonight, we have a committee, the Great Lakes Committee, that is a League of Women Voters committee that has been working for probably 4 to 6 weeks on getting this event put together, and we have a panel of distinguished people to help us understand how complex the issue is and how important it is to our state. So I want to welcome Carrie Turner, who is going to basically moderate tonight, and we'll introduce you to the speakers and move us along with the meeting. But welcome, thank you for being here.
All right, well, I'll echo Sally's thank you, and I really appreciate all the enthusiasm that I see in the room tonight. And I also want to thank our speakers for making time to come. Unfortunately, we can't give everyone as much time as we'd like. So we wanted to present a variety of viewpoints and a variety of information. The League of Women Voters is really about education, and that's why we're here tonight. So I got just a couple administrative things I want to mention. Most of you probably saw a sign-up sheet when you came in and signed in. If you didn't, I just want to let you know that it's out there. It's if you want to get into the League of Women Voters loop, or we also have some other resources out there, a list of resources related to Line 5. If you sign up and include your email address, we can email you that resource list, and then you just have to click on the links as opposed to typing in the URL. Do that if you haven't already. Another thing I wanted to mention is that the committee members are all walking around with name tags on, so if you have a question about our committee or League of Women Voters, find one of us and we'll try to answer as best we can. And then I want to talk a little bit about the format for tonight. We're going to have a series of speakers that are listed here, and I'll introduce each one, and they'll come up one by one. Some of them have PowerPoints to walk through, some don't. So we're going to go through the set of speakers, and then we're going to move to a panel discussion, which is why we have this table set up with these chairs. And we'll be soliciting questions via index card. So as we transition between speakers, if you have a question, raise your hand, and one of our volunteers, committee members, will give you an index card. You can write your question down, raise it up again when you're done, and we'll collect them, and then we'll try to group similar questions together. And we want to try to make sure, we thought we could do it this way so we get through as many questions as possible. And as you write your question, if there's somebody specific, one of our speakers that you want to have the question directed to, write their name on it as well. So that way we can make sure that we can try to get the question to the right person. And then there is some literature and swag out at the tables. You can peruse that on your way out. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sean McBrearty with Clean Water Action. He is here because he's also an organizer of Oil and Water Don't Mix, and we're really excited to have him here. And let me just get the right presentation here. So I'm going to invite him up to take over, and then we'll go from there. Thanks.
Cool. Cool. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Carrie, and thank you all for coming tonight, and the League of Women Voters for putting on this great event. So this is a bit of an abbreviated presentation tonight, so I'm just going to get right into it. The Oil and Water Don't Mix campaign began back in 2013 to shed a light on what's going on with Line 5. So far, we've really grown. We have 74 organizations who have signed on, 250 businesses, 15 tribal organizations, and we have 66 different governmental units within Michigan, counties, townships, and cities who have passed resolutions calling on the governor and attorney general to do the right thing and shut down this pipeline. So to be clear on that point, although there are a lot of things going on with Line 5 right now, the only two decision makers with the actual authority to shut down Line 5 are Governor Snyder and Attorney General Schuette. Either one of them could, at the drop of a hat, shut down Line 5 by revoking the easement that Line 5 that Enbridge has with the state because of the multiple easement violations that Enbridge has had over the past 64 years. So Line 5 itself, owned and operated by Enbridge, the folks who brought us the Kalamazoo oil spill back in 2010. It's a 64-year-old pipeline, goes from Superior, Wisconsin to Sarnia, Ontario, and transports Canadian oil straight through Michigan. So on its journey there, it travels through 3 national forests, the Straits of Mackinac, and 11 separate Great Lakes tributaries. They flow up to 23 million gallons of oil through the Straits Pipeline every day. Now, most days out of the month, it's running light crude. About 2 or 3 days out of the month, it's running propane, which it's not running pure propane, it's running NGLs, which is a sort of liquefied version of propane with a lot of different additives in it that are used in different products. So the Coast Guard's biggest worry here is that Line 5 comes within 250 yards of Lake Michigan along US 2 in the Upper Peninsula. This is, of course, the big worry other than the Straits is this whole section where it's right along US 2 along Lake Michigan. This, according to David Schwab, who we'll be hearing from in a little bit, is the worst possible place for an oil spill in the Great Lakes, is through the Straits here. So this is just a flow showing the current changes in the Straits of Mackinac, current changes every day and a half about, and I'm sure Dr. Schwab will have a little bit more to say about the currents up there and how it would carry the oil. The worst case here, 700 miles of shoreline impacted by an oil spill in Line 5. A point on this, Enbridge makes the audacious claim that they can shut down Line 5 in 8 minutes after being able to tell there was a spill. If we look at their history back in 2010 with the Kalamazoo oil spill, they claim their response time was 11 minutes. It was really 17 hours from the time they detected a leak until they shut the pipeline down. And in the meantime, when they detected the drop in pressure in their line at their command center, instead of shutting it down because there might be a leak, they thought there was blockage, so they increased the pressure on the line, which is what caused the tremendous, disastrous size of the Kalamazoo oil spill. So, if an oil spill were to occur in the Straits, these are some of the things that would happen. The drinking water source for Mackinac Island, St. Ignace, and Alpena would all be cut off. Northern Michigan tourism, of course, would be devastated, with the Great Lakes being the big attraction. And this would damage up to 50% of the tribal fishing harvest, which has been an issue that a lot of the Northern Michigan tribes have brought up with the state so far. Federal pipeline spill incident reports show us that all steel pipelines corrode with time. Line 5 is no exception to that. We found evidence that Line 5 has corrosion, especially across the 19 separate sections of Line 5 that have coating delaminations similar to the sort of delaminations they saw on Line 6B before the Kalamazoo oil spill. To put a finer point on what the coating delaminations are, Enbridge uses a real cute term. They call it coating holidays. But what it really is 19 places in the line. So there's supposed to be 3 levels of protection between the steel of the pipeline and the current of the Straits of Mackinac. There's the steel itself. On top of that is, they used to refer to it as a coal tar sealant. They now call it an asphalt sealant. Whichever, doesn't matter in this case. On top of that is an inner fiberglass wrap and then an outer fiberglass wrap. There is evidence out there that the sections of the pipeline have these coating delaminations where you can see where the outer wrap ends, you can see where the interior fiberglass wrap ends, and you can see rust spots poking through the enamel layer, whether it's asphalt or coal tar. Again, doesn't really matter, but you can see the rust spots poking through. So this is a damaged pipeline. Another problem that they've had is failure to recognize critical flaws. Causes a lot of oil spills, including, again, Line 6B. And Line 5 has leaked before. A lot of these leaks go undetected by pipeline companies, or at least unreported, as is the case of one of the Enbridge leaks in the Upper Peninsula that happened in the 80s and wasn't revealed until 2012. So Enbridge has 800 oil spills between 1999 and 2010, including a total of 6 to 8 million gallons of oil spilled across all of their projects. This is a map showing the 29 separate places where oil spills have occurred on Line 5 itself. These have all been pretty small oil spills, but again, a warning that we have, this aging, old line that is not capable or safe to run through the Straits of Mackinac. So this is a little bit on the 6B rupture. It was built in 1969, so it was 41 years old when line 6B ruptured, a little bit younger than we are with line 5 right now. Again, claimed response time 11 minutes, the actual response took 17 hours. So, the easement violations in the Straits. Big one I want to address, other than the coating delaminations, which is another violation of the easement. Unsupported pipe and spans. So there's a Detroit news story going around, a Free Press story going around the room about a recent revelation on the unsupported pipes and spans. They were able to uncover through FOIA requests that Enbridge knew as long ago as 2003 that they had 16 sections of pipeline unsupported of over 140 feet. Put that into a little more context, if you take the steel used to build the pipeline, the yield strength of the steel is about 35,000 pounds per square inch. If you don't count for any pressure added by the current of the Straits, once you get a span of about 160 feet, you're reaching the yield strength of the steel. So you're reaching a point where the steel is at serious danger of permanently deforming. The largest spans that were found in this report from 2003 were 286 feet and 224. So, well beyond the math here for keeping it open. So, another problem that we have, the exposed portion of the pipeline, you're looking at part of it here, is heavily covered in zebra mussels, which makes a detailed analysis of the coating impossible. But from what we can see from the videos that National Wildlife Federation took over the last couple dives that they did, you can see spots again where there are the coating delaminations on the pipeline. So this is a map of the pipelines with, it's hard to see on here, but the dots, the black dots on here are potential sites where the protective coating could be missing. The oil spill recovery in the Straits. Some of the interesting things learned in the Pipeline Safety Advisory Board process have been that the best case scenario for the Coast Guard is a 40% oil recovery rate. That's absolute best case scenario. To put a bit of a finer point on this, if there are huge waves in the Straits of Mackinac, anything larger than, the Coast Guard testified anything larger than 3 to 5 foot waves in the Straits of Mackinac, they would not be sending anybody out on the Straits in the event of a spill. There are 3 to 5 foot waves through the Straits of Mackinac on a pretty regular basis. So recovering 40% of the oil, you're really talking the handful of days where you have perfect conditions going through the Straits of Mackinac. Winter ice conditions make oil spill recovery even more challenging. One of the plans that they presented is not currently allowed in the Great Lakes, but they would seek to use in situ burning, which is basically where they put a big hole in the ice, light the oil on fire, and count that as part of their cleanup. Yeah. Yes. Yes, and they can't work at night. Thank you. Oh, and the other thing that we found out was, so all the safety equipment that they should have in place in case of an oil spill is not even in state. It would take up to 24 hours for them to get all the equipment that they need in position to be able to deploy it into the Straits. They're not even ready for it for a 3 to 4 hour response getting out on the water if there were perfect conditions and it happened. These are a couple of their claims and what we found out about their claims. 65%, Enbridge's first number was 85%. Even they must have thought that was too audacious. They claim 65% of the UP heat their homes with Line 5 propane. The real facts behind that is 98% of Line 5's liquefied natural gas goes straight to Sarnia, Ontario. Now, with those numbers, so that 98% doesn't directly contradict the 65% of UP propane. However, what we've found is that with the volume that they're sending that's being offloaded in the UP, it could account for at most 30 to 35% of the UP's propane supply and could be replaced by one train car or 3 tanker trucks daily. Now, obviously, in most cases, tanker trucks and trains are not the safest way to transport propane. However, from the offloading spot in the UP, that's how it's transported anyway. They, instead of offloading it in Superior, Wisconsin, which they could do with the propane, they offload it in Michigan, the 2% that gets offloaded there, and distribute from there. So this wouldn't even really be a major change in their distribution, except it would be coming from Superior, Wisconsin, and not from the UP itself. The other claim, 30% of Michigan's gasoline comes from Line 5. Fact on that, 4.4% of Michigan's gasoline comes from Line 5. The interesting fact that about 5% of the oil that flows through Line 5 actually goes to the Marathon Refinery in Detroit, which many of you are probably aware is one of the biggest air polluters in the state of Michigan. So there's another benefit to keeping Line 5 around. So polls have been showing 63% of Michigan voters think pipelines shouldn't be allowed to operate under the Great Lakes. Just another interesting thing we found out last weekend. A lot of folks were up in Petoskey for the Pipeline Safety Advisory Board meeting that they held up north. And I went up on Sunday hearing reports that with high wind conditions, a vehicle went off the bridge, or a trailer went off the bridge or something like that. I only heard a brief part of it. Then we found out that actually another thing that happened because of the high wind conditions on that random sunny, nice Sunday, one of the tankers going through the Straits had to drop anchor in the Straits. One of our folks called the Coast Guard to confirm the story and to see if they knew anything else about it. They don't even track that. So tankers drop their anchors in the Straits all the time. The worst case scenario here is really one of those giant anchors cutting across both pipelines that run through the Straits and causing a massive spill. That's something that we've just gotten lucky on for the last 64 years. The other thing is Line 5 is not on a lot of nautical maps because it's considered a national security risk to show exactly where a pipeline is that could be easily attacked. So, the state is publicly releasing a Line 5 alternative study later this month, next week. They were supposed to be releasing a risks study and an alternative study. For the past 2 years, one of the things we've been doing in the Oil and Water Don't Mix campaign is calling out the rampant conflicts of interests going on in the alternatives analysis. The alternatives analysis is being done by a company called Dynamic Risk, which has a lot of business ties with Enbridge, works on a lot of different projects with Enbridge. Now, we found out this morning that the state is canceling the risks study. They fired Del Norte Veritas, I believe, a Norwegian company that they hired to do the risks analysis, citing conflicts of interest between DNV and Enbridge. Here's the interesting thing. Enbridge's Chief of Operations for the United States, Brad Shamla, is on the Pipeline Safety Advisory Board. They knew about this conflict of interest 2 years ago. So it raises a big question with us as to why they're canceling the risks study a week before it's supposed to be released publicly. There's a good chance there's something damning in that report, and that's the real reason it's being withheld by the state. We've actually today FOIA'd everything from the Attorney General's office relating to the risks analysis so that we can try to make that risks analysis public. Now, there still will be a public support or a public comment period starting on July 6th and going till August 4th on the risks, just on the alternatives analysis that is still going to be released, which is a weird thing in its own, right? I mean, the state of Michigan has a legal duty to protect the Great Lakes as a public trust. So we really ought to just be studying the risks. It's Enbridge's job to figure out how to get their product to market. We shouldn't have a role in determining an alternative. However, the state didn't see it that way. They're studying both, but now they're only releasing the alternatives. So that's what the public comment period will be on. We're also encouraging folks to go to the public comment meetings and call for full transparency with what's going on with this risk study. Because once again, there's also conflicts of interest with the alternative study. We know about the conflicts of interest in the alternative study, yet that one, for some reason, is still being released to the public, while the risk study is not. These are the 6 alternatives that they're studying: building new pipelines that don't travel through the Great Lakes, using existing pipelines elsewhere, using rail, tankers, or barges, replacing Line 5 in the States, maintaining existing Line 5 in the Straits, and decommissioning Line 5 altogether. As far as we're concerned with the Oil and Water Don't Mix campaign, the only reasonable solution here is Alternative 6, a full decommission of Line 5, before it causes more problems for Michigan here. So the studies that we're talking about, Enbridge is funding these studies, $3.6 million. So we know they're not going to be, non-biased, independent studies the way they're supposed to be anyway. Oil industry firms have been contracted. A lot of them have ties to Enbridge. Enbridge, Marathon are officially advising Governor Snyder, and the DEQ's new chief, of course, is a former BP oil executive who ran their PR department through Deepwater Horizon. So public pressure is the really, really big thing that we're going to need over this summer. During this public comment period over the next month, we're having, I'm just going to highlight the two events that are within driving distance of Ann Arbor in a reasonable day. The first one, the Lansing Alternatives Analysis, is going to be really important. 5 o'clock on Thursday, July 6th at Holt High School. And what that's going to have is the contractor, Dynamic Risk, who did the alternatives analysis, is going to be there. They're going to provide the public with an hour-long explanation of their report, followed by what we've been hearing is a Q&A with the public. So we're going to really work to stack that room. I hope everybody here can make it out to that event. The other things they're going to be holding are later in July, Monday, July 24th, 8 o'clock a.m., same location, Holt High School. Is going to be a public comment meeting, and they're also holding two up north, one on July 24th in Traverse City, one on July 25th in St. Ignace. So after the public comment period ends on August 5th, they're doing this secondary public comment period where people will have the opportunity. So the idea is the state is making all the public comments that have been submitted available online. The second public comment period will be an opportunity for people to go through and respond to the public comments. So good opportunity again for some activism online and responding to the comments after the actual session is over. And this is the end of the presentation. This is just an artist's rendition of what it would look like from the Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island in the event of a spill.
We're going to save questions.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you.
All right, well, thanks, Sean. That was very sobering. Okay, I want to queue up our next speaker, which is Dr. David Schwab from the University of Michigan. Dr. Schwab's been involved in research on waves, currents, and water level changes in the Great Lakes since the 1970s. He retired from his position as scientist and group leader at the NOAA Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab in Ann Arbor in 2012, and currently holds an appointment at the University of Michigan Water Center, where he teaches and works on special projects like Enbridge Line 5 and harmful algal blooms. So get you set up
Thank
here,
you,
Dr.
Karen.
Schwab.
And
thank
those
you.
dates are actually important. When I retired is an important date in this talk. Because just one of the last projects I worked on at the Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab was working with my colleague there to do a computer model of currents in the Straits of Mackinac. And at that time, we ran the first simulations of what currents are like under the Mackinac Bridge that was accurate and had ability to predict currents into the future. I retired. Eric took over my job at the lab. I got an appointment at the university at the Water Center, which is part of the Graham Sustainability Institute. Just at that same time, in 2012, there was a report commissioned by the National Wildlife Federation called Sunken Hazards. If you were a co-author of this report, raise your hand. Oh, Beth Wallace is going to speak later. She was one of the authors of this report. And even though I'm often quoted as the source of the saying that the Line 5 is, or the Straits of Mackinac are the worst place to have an oil spill, Beth and her co-author Jeff Alexander actually say that those currents also make the Straits one of the worst places in the Great Lakes for an oil spill in their report. So I think great minds think alike in those terms. But the important thing is, at the Water Center, the director was friends with the director of the Wildlife Federation here in Ann Arbor, and he said, Dave, I see you just did this thing about currents in the Straits. Did you know about this pipeline in the Straits? I said, I never heard of it until I read this report that Beth put out, and I wasn't alone. I think many people didn't know about that pipeline until then. He said, well, maybe you should talk to Andy Buxbaum over at the Wildlife Federation and see if there's anything you can do. And I think in the report, Beth would agree that they could see a problem, but they couldn't quantify how bad it might be if there was a spill up there. And I thought I might be able to help do that with some of the information we now had about currents in the Straits of Mackinac. So I'll tell you a little bit about what I know, what I learned, what we can model, what we can do, and what we found out about what currents in the Straits of Mackinac could do in the event of an oil spill. By the way, if you're interested in this report that this talk is based on, you can get it online at that website. And there's more information there and links and things too. And probably most of the websites for oil and water and flow and so on will have links to this stuff. So this is the report that Eric Anderson and I did in 2012, published in Journal of Great Lakes Research, scientific paper about a computer model for simulating flow. And what we learned in that paper is you really need to simulate the flow in all of Lake Michigan and all of Lake Huron to get the flow in the Straits correct. So these models need to do both lakes at the same time. The graph on the right side here is a measurement from a current meter in the Straits of Mackinac, and it's a period of about 6 months in 1990. And what do you see in that? You see a lot of up and down, right? And that up and down is indicating flow eastward and westward through the Straits. Is that kind of bizarre? It's going in both directions and changing rapidly. Over a long period of time, we know that water has to get out of Lake Michigan and into Lake Huron. The amount of water that has to get out of Lake Michigan and into Lake Huron, if you graphed it on that graph, you wouldn't even see it. It would be almost zero compared to these oscillations. So there's huge amounts of water going back and forth every 2 or 3 days. If you average it over a long period, it accounts for that flow from Michigan to Huron, but it's changing direction all the time. This is amazing. There's nothing like it anywhere else that I know of. So the main results from that scientific paper were that flow in the Straits is constantly changing direction every 1.5, 2.5, 3.5 days. Depends on weather conditions. The model that we developed uses the weather conditions to estimate what the flow is going to be like in the Straits, and it's very accurate. The oscillating flow, the amount of that flow can be up to 20 times the mean outflow from Lake Michigan to Lake Huron. That's why I'm saying it would be that mean flow is very small compared to the oscillating flow. And it's up to 5 or 10 times the flow over Niagara Falls. So there can be the 5 or 10 times the amount of water going over Niagara Falls can be moving from Michigan to Huron or Huron to Michigan, depending on the day of the week. But the good news is the time varying flow patterns can be now accurately predicted by this computer model. This model is being put into operation at NOAA, so it'll be run on a real-time basis, and the information will be available to Coast Guard or whoever. You know this stuff, I don't have to go through that, where the pipeline crosses the Straits, so on. So my study in 2016, the first study I did was in 2014, kind of a pilot study for the big effort in 2016. Using the currents from that Anderson-Schwab model, we did 840 simulated spills. And the reason you want to do that is that the conditions there vary so frequently, so often, that you can't tell, you can't predict what's going to happen. So to get a statistical estimate of the area that might be impacted, you have to look at a lot of different cases. So we ran 840 different cases. It's 840 different sets of weather conditions, different times during the year. And a case means releasing a simulated oil spill in the Straits, and using this computer model to move the oil with the currents. And this is pretty well known how to do that kind of thing. So that part of it is not in question. The main purpose of this is to get 840 different estimates and hope that we can cover the range of possibilities of what might happen to oil. That was the purpose of the study. We used 3 different estimates for how much oil would be spilled. 5,000 barrels is the lowest number that Enbridge estimates as the worst case. They said in the worst possible case, we think maybe up to 5,000 barrels could be released in something if we didn't catch it right away. Later on, they revised that to 10,000 barrels. And 25,000 barrels is what was released in the 6B spill. So we did all 3 of those. National Wildlife Federation said, why don't you just cover it all? And some of the things that went into my study were criticized by Enbridge, by the vice president, and he really misunderstood what was going on, or misrepresented what was done in the study. I didn't write a rebuttal to him in the press, but I wrote to the Pipeline Advisory Board so they knew what was going on in his stuff. It tells we used real oil characteristics for like crude oil. We assume no open water cleanup, which is the worst case, and not an unrealistic case, given that you can't clean up at night and you can't clean up when the waves are much higher than a foot or two. And that beached oil stays beached. And that's kind of a worst case too. It's not resuspended by waves. So those are the assumptions that go into this study. And keep in mind that 1 barrel is 40 gallons of oil. The simulations represent the oil as little particles, and the amount of oil that each particle represents can be, let's see, there's 10,000 particles released. So in the medium-sized case, 10,000, each particle represents 1 barrel. In the small case, each particle represents half a barrel. And in the big case, each particle represents 2.5 barrels. Okay, so keep that in mind. I made then some animations of a few of the cases. 6 of them are posted on the website if you want to look at them. I'll show you one of them, okay? One of 840 things that might happen to oil released in the Straits. And the surprising thing we found, maybe not surprising, is that these cases are completely different. Anything can happen. It can go north, it can go south, it can go east, it can go west. It can beach within 6 hours. It can stay away from shore for 24 hours. So it's a bad place. And I think the point of the report ended up being that, in my estimation, that's the worst place in the Great Lakes to have an oil spill. That it would be moving so fast, unpredictable direction, and very difficult to clean up. Affect a large amount of shoreline. So here's one of the cases. We call it case 5. Uh-oh. Are we in trouble here? Oh, we'll see. And what you're going to see is little particles. Hopefully you'll see particles being released here. And watch the counter here. This tells the time after the release. This case starts on July 1st at 6 a.m., okay? And then there's an elapsed time counter. And then this tells the percent of oil that has been beached and the percent or the amount of impacted shoreline. And impacted shoreline will be colored pink as the animation goes on. So you'll be able to see how far it spreads along the shoreline. And remember, this is just one of the cases. I picked one of the worst ones, so obviously, but everything in between happens too. So let's see if this will play now. Here. Oh, wrong one. It went automatically when we practiced.
I wonder, do you have time to talk about that?
Yeah, here we go. Finally, I just had to press harder. So you can see now we're at 2 days after the spill. You're already past Boblo Island, coming around into Lake Huron, past Sheboygan, getting down to Rogers City. This is scary, you know, as Sean was saying. I guess the cleanup equipment would just about be arriving, you know, after a day or two. It's already, the horse is out of the barn by then. And I can show you similar cases where the same thing happens on the Michigan side. In this particular case, oil moves almost exclusively eastward, with 30% of the oil beached on Mackinac and Boblo Islands within a day, within a day or two. After 3 days, it's spread into Lake Huron from Mackinac City to Sheboygan. In 15 days, it's as far south as Presqu'île in Lake Huron. And it ends up being, some oil could reach into Saginaw Bay from a spill. So you get the idea. Now, we ran 840 of these cases and then developed statistics about the vulnerability of different parts of the shoreline. How many of those 840 different weather conditions would affect Mackinac Island? How many of those would affect the Lake Michigan shoreline? So the results of that in the report, there's many figures and graphs, but two of the most popular ones are these: the probability of sufficient beached oil to require cleanup. And you've heard this number, 700 miles of shoreline could be affected. And what that means is that of those 840 cases, at least one of the cases spilled oil on part of that 700 miles. So where at the edges here, you know, there's only a few cases that would reach down this far. Where the colors are darker, many, many more cases, and you can quantify it in percentage. So graphs like this will be useful for contingency planning and for the state to figure out where the vulnerable areas are. If you need to do a full risk assessment, like the state was trying to commission, you need this number as part of the risk assessment. You multiply this by the value of the resource along the shoreline. You look at the probability of that part of the shoreline being impacted times the value of the resource and add those all up. And that gives you a dollar amount for your risk. So this study actually would be one small part of that entire risk analysis. Some of the, and then on the right side, that graph is showing the probability that oil would be visible on the surface offshore, okay, from a spill, from one of these 840 spills. So in some cases, it's as far down as Saginaw Bay, southern part of Lake Huron, not quite as far into Lake Michigan. But in over half of the cases, the red areas, you know, you've got 30 miles into Lake Michigan and 50 or 100 miles into Lake Huron. So it's a big area that if the oil company says that they think they could contain it, I don't know, it would be not very credible. So I just put on the top here some of the publicity that came out after this report and the quotes about the worst possible place that I share with Beth, that quote now. And on the bottom is an animation that my colleague Eric Anderson at NOAA did. When I talk about why it's the worst place, you go compared to what? So he did an oil spill in the middle of Lake Michigan and one in Lake Erie and compared it to the Straits. So those are all on the same scale. The light color is if the oil's on the surface, and the dark color is if the oil is mixed in the water column. Currents go in different directions in the lakes at different depths during the summertime. But which one is the worst? You tell me. I don't have to. Okay? And that's all I have.
Okay, great, thank you. That was really, really interesting. So I want to introduce Beth Wallace from the National Wildlife Federation. Dave referenced her. But before we do that, I wanted to introduce her by way of introduction, bring up one of the videos that the National Wildlife Federation has put together, focused mostly on Line 6B and the oil spill in 2010 near Kalamazoo. And we thought that this would be a timely thing, even though it's not directly related to the Straits of Mackinac, because it gets at, Dave just talked about, what a spill would look like. This video does a really good job of showing what the aftermath of a spill has on the community. So we want to show this to kind of get you thinking about that, and then I'll have Beth come up and talk a little bit more about National Wildlife Federation's perspective. So let me do this.
First heard the report of, well, there's an oil spill, we thought, oh, something had spilled out of a truck or something. We didn't expect to have 1.1 million gallons of crude oil.
I'll never forget, the water was high then, as it is now, but it was black. And it smelled like you were in the middle of a diesel plant.
I'm sure it was 2 years. 35 miles of Talmadge Creek and the Kalamazoo River were completely off limits to people. Then after that, there were additional areas that had to be closed off as more contamination was found and more cleanup had to be done.
I never imagined, well, I'm going to be involved in a incident of national significance and we're going to deal with an oil spill, or that I would be doing it 7 years after the event.
The cruel irony is we knew this pipeline had defects right in that section where it ruptured along the Talmadge Creek. We knew that. But the federal regulatory agency didn't require them to address them.
There are lots of questions about what kinds of health hazards are there. And in terms of knowing everything, we may never know everything.
We are currently doing our long-term water monitoring. We pick potable water wells in locations where if there's going to be something that's going to happen, it's most likely going to be in those spots. And what we're looking for is the presence of any of the fingerprint chemicals related to the Enbridge oil. We're looking for the petroleum-based hydrocarbons and such. We don't anticipate that there's going to be a problem, but it's that, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So if we take that extra diligence and do it now, then we'll have that information to base further decisions on.
This oil was not the standard classic flowing oil. This was diluted bitumen, which means that you have these highly volatile chemicals that you dissolve the asphalt tar in, and that allows it to flow through the pipeline.
We have really found no effect to the groundwater, and we were very lucky in that case. And a lot of that had to do with the characteristic of the oil, that after the layer ends burned out and it submerged, it bonded with a lot of the soil, the sediment particles, and it was too large then to go any further into the water table. So we were lucky.
Because we still had some dams in place, which sort of slowed the progress of the oil, and a very, very prompt response from our EPA. We were sort of fortunate in that the BP Deep Horizon oil spill had occurred. They had learned some lessons then. They had companies ready to go, contractors that were literally brought up from the Gulf Coast to this area to very quickly to deal with this spill.
I mean, there was fear at that time that Canadian tar sands oil and the chemicals that allow it to flow would actually hit Lake Michigan.
So we're looking at a map of the oil spill from the EPA site, but this map here does show how far are we. So we're now at nearly 7 years after the spill. It's 35 miles in this colored zone here of Talmadge Creek and the Kalamazoo River. And so far they have gotten about 3 miles at which they say that they have approved the no further action report.
One of the things we learned with this oil spill is that the absolute need for sustainability. This is not something you're going to be done with in a week or two. You better plan on months and years and such, because there's a lot of ripples.
We also know where line 5 runs under the Straits of Mackinac. That should not happen.
It's not clear what the long-term habitat damage has been. It was a relatively thorough cleanup by all measures that I am aware of. Is it the end of the story? Well, that's a lot harder to say.
But we should never allow a pipeline to jeopardize our Great Lakes. Never.
Great. So I just want to mention that that's one of 3 videos that the National Wildlife Federation has released. In fact, we just released one earlier this week. It's a little bit longer in length, about 7 minutes, but it's my favorite, so I hope that you'll check it out.
Yes, and just to add to that, we have a page of resources in the back, and we put links to all 3 of your videos on that. So,
Great. Yeah.
Yep. All right, thanks, Bill.
So my name is Beth Wallace, and I work with the National Wildlife Federation. I've worked with them for about 10 years now and started focusing on pipelines. Let me know if I'm talking too loud. I have a loud voice. Started working on pipelines immediately following the 2010 spill. I became really involved in that spill because my family's actually from the area, and a lot of my friends and relatives were directly impacted. So I dove into it, trying to understand what went wrong and how we can prevent it, which ultimately led to me writing the report that David mentioned, the Sunken Hazard Report on Line 5. So I'm going to move quickly because I know we want to get to Q&A. But I want to touch on several points. Some of my presentation has already been covered, and so I'll move quick, and then let's dive in. So 10 days prior to the 2010 release, Enbridge actually sat before a congressional committee and said that they could detect a leak instantaneously. And the reason why they were before this congressional committee is actually because Line 6B had so many defects along it that they were asking for extensions to repair the defects. And as mentioned earlier, Line 6B, they knew of the defects 5 years prior to the release, but what they didn't anticipate was that those 5 cracks that they knew about would fuse into one and create this 6-foot gash in the pipeline. This was the largest and most costly, one of the most largely and most costly inland oil spills in U.S. history. Enbridge claims that they spilled 840,000 gallons, but the EPA maintains that they have already cleaned up over 1.2 million gallons. And so there's a huge discrepancy. And that became very contentious with us in particular because EPA Clean Water Act fines are based on how much oil is spilled, and when the at-fault party is saying one number and the agency is saying another, there's huge discrepancies. Ultimately, they settled on the 840,000 gallons, but with the natural resource damage assessment, they acknowledged that there was a substantial amount of oil that was recovered beyond that point. This failure was a system of failures. It wasn't just an accident. It was a culture that was completely inept in maintaining a pipeline of this age, of this characteristic. And that's what really got me going on this particular project, is understanding the depth at which they did not properly maintain this pipeline and respond following the release. As mentioned, it was a 17-hour release. Not only did they know that the pipeline, there were alarms going off, the system was telling them something was wrong, they ignored it, they increased pressure. They did not find the spill. It was actually a local Consumers Energy person who discovered the spill and reported it to Enbridge. There were further delays, several hours where Enbridge did not report it to the national reporting system, and so that delayed the federal response. And then the week following, they continued to underplay how much was actually spilled, how they were responding. I remember I showed up, it had to have been close to day 3 at this point because the media didn't get wind of it until day 2. And there were barely any booms. There were barely any people. There was a stake in the ground that said, if you have health concerns, call this number. If you have wildlife concerns, call this number. We tried calling it because we came across wildlife that was frantically trying to clean itself. Nobody answered. Come to find out, that number went directly to Enbridge. They were dispersing the calls to the appropriate agencies that may be responding or themselves. And it was just complete chaos for the first week. It took them a solid week to set up animal response and then another solid week to actually get animals into the response. Not only that, but there were people living all along the river who were never formally evacuated. I know several people personally who were at home doing chemotherapy. They were being exposed to benzene 24 hours a day. Not only did they live right on the river, their business was right on the river, and they were never told to leave or formally evacuated. At least that's Enbridge's response and position. Ultimately, there were 150 homes that Enbridge ended up buying out from people that lived along the river because they no longer wanted to live in their homes. Either they felt the homes were too contaminated in several cases, or they thought their property value was completely destroyed. Those homes have just started now to trickle back onto the market. Wildlife, there were over 4,000 animals that were directly impacted by this spill. Most of those were turtles or reptiles. The turtles did fare pretty well, although they found out the hard way that when they were cleaning the turtles, tagging them, and releasing them, they had a homing mechanism that were taking them right back to the same places that were making them get oiled. So they kept seeing the same turtles over and over again. Mammals had a really bad mortality rate, around 50%. They were not as lucky, but if you go on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, they have a good breakdown on how wildlife are directly impacted. Like I said, this got me really interested in pipelines, and I started to look at Line 5. And some of my presentation will cover a lot of what Sean has already covered, and so I'll skim through, and then I made a couple notes on things that I think are relevant and important that have not been covered. But I wanted to go over the Enbridge pipeline mapping system with folks because while Line 5 is critical and important, it's also important to understand how many people know about Keystone XL debate. So the same time Keystone XL was going on, this pipeline was being proposed, got all the attention in the world, we had the 6B rupture. Following the 6B rupture, Enbridge decided they needed to, as a safety precaution, replace Line 6B. What this meant was that they left the old 30-inch pipeline in its place, and they built a brand new pipeline right next to it that was 36 inches. And why this is relevant is because one of the proposals for Line 5 is a replacement. And people need to understand replacement in industry terms never means replacement. It means building a brand new pipeline in its place. That may not be what they do with the Straits because of its unique situation, but it's important to know for the inland section, we will likely see, if that's what the state moves forward with, all land being taken away from the people that already have right-of-ways and a huge construction project going on. Not only was Line 6B replaced, but Enbridge also expanded all of these pipelines. They expanded Line 5 in 2012. They expanded several pipelines here. They're expanding pipelines here. They built pipelines down south. So while everybody was paying attention to Keystone XL, that export pipeline, and how horrible it was bringing tar sands down, the same exact thing was happening with Enbridge. And they were allowed to move forward with it because of the safety risk. This should have been a presidential permit. They should have been required to do a lot more to get that expansion pushed through, but because of the safety and the emergency mandate following the spill, they were allowed to replace that pipeline without being noticed at all. Also, Line 5, I want to go back, oops. Line 5, I briefly mentioned it was expanded in 2012. Presidential permits should be put in place when a pipeline changes operation. They changed operation by either 10 or 20% of Line 5 was increased. So that amount of product was pushed through in 2012 over the previous number. They should have been required at that point to get a presidential permit because this has an international border crossing at the St. Clair River. They should have been required to get an international permit, which would have triggered federal comment periods, NEPA would have been triggered, environmental assessments, public comments, you name it. But when we went to DC to lobby the State Department, Keystone XL was at its height. Nobody was really paying attention to Line 5, unfortunately, and they told me, we determine existing pipelines on a case-by-case basis, and we need to hear from senators, and unfortunately, it just happened, and there was no public pressure at that point. Around the same time that we were doing that work, we decided to dive Line 5, and that really got our attention when we started to come across some scary pieces of the pipeline. The coating was obviously covered, you could not see it. We also came across huge mounds of debris that were stacked on top of the pipeline, and then zebra mussels galore, which raised a lot of questions and started to get the state to pay attention to maybe there was a larger risk here. We've already talked a lot about supports, but one thing that we did not discuss, well, you did cover the 280-foot support span, correct? Okay. This is a picture of the holidays that Sean mentioned. So this is the protective coating that has completely peeled away of the pipeline. And what's important about this, and I'm not sure that you mentioned, I apologize if you did, but the easement that's with Enbridge through the state of Michigan requires that Enbridge has these coatings on the pipeline. They have to have a certain number of these coatings, otherwise they're in violation of the easement. So the fact that they're just now revealing that they have holidays, potentially 19 holidays on the pipeline, is a very clear violation of the easement, along with the supports and the spans that continue to go be acknowledged by Enbridge almost yearly at this point. I also want to say that when I started out on this project, and if you've read the Sunken Hazard Report, you know that we went into that not really knowing what was going on, and we wanted to bring awareness to it. And the whole time that we've tried to get information from Enbridge, from the state, from the federal agencies, we've hit roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. It's only when we spend thousands of dollars and go down and dive the pipeline and reveal these things and ask more questions, and we have evidence and we push Enbridge, do they actually reveal issues. And it's not until the state has become involved and forced Enbridge's hand to reveal a lot of the information that they've revealed that the real risk has started to present itself in the last year. So I'm going to skip through this. I apologize. So I was the one who commissioned the 29 spills that we discovered on Line 5. I wanted to, Sean mentioned a couple locations that are really critical. Not only is the Straits portion high risk, all through these locations, the pipeline comes within a couple miles of any of the Great Lakes. In some of these locations, particularly right here, it's complete wetlands. And why this matters is Line 5 in the Straits of Mackinac, Enbridge touts that it's a much thicker steel, and it's safe, and it's overbuilt. I'd argue maybe some of those points aren't as accurate as they say they are, but what's important to understand about the inland section of Line 5, it's a single 30-inch pipeline that's incredibly thinner, and it's had all kinds of issues that have been tied to it. And some of the incident reports that we've gotten our hands on have showed that some of the seams along the inland section of Line 5 actually have stress corrosion cracking happening. This is the same exact cracking that caused the 2006B rupture. And the fact that they have this is evidence that they may have a system-wide issue with Line 5, and it's not just the Straits portion that we need to be concerned about. We also need to be heavily monitoring what kind of inspections they're doing with the inland section, what kind of issues are they turning up, how are they addressing those issues. We do know from this inspection report and this integrity dig that how they correct this particular issue is they take a sleeve of a pipeline and basically put it over the pipeline and then weld it on versus taking the old pipeline out and replacing it with new. A couple quick things I wanted to mention just in relation to the previous presentations. Line 5 in the Straits of Mackinac, you'll often hear Enbridge claim that it's a seamless pipe. However, that's not accurate. This pipeline, while it doesn't have a horizontal sleeve, seam when they fold it, there's usually a horizontal seam. It does not have that, but it has seams every 45 feet where they had to weld each section together. And if I remember correctly, it's a couple thousand welds for this pipeline in the Straits crossing. And so when we talk about having supports every 75 feet, that's critical because of all the welds that are in that location. And when you talk about currents oscillating back and forth and stressing that pipeline, think about that span that was 280 feet long that went unsupported for 5 years. They knew about it. It went back and forth with currents for those 5 years at least. And what kind of permanent stress damage did that do to that section of pipeline? To this day, Enbridge claims the worst case scenario is 3-minute shutdown. The risk assessment that was canceled today was evaluating worst case scenario. That's what the task force mandated that be carried out, because worst case scenario is obviously not a 3-minute shutdown. That is the absolute best case scenario, and we all acknowledge that. The state was doing that assessment because they were evaluating what kind of resources Enbridge needs to have in a worst case scenario. And because we no longer have this risk assessment happening, we have nothing for the state to go back to Enbridge and say, you know, the $1 million we required you to have when you built that pipeline, it actually needs to be like $22 billion for you to address a spill in this location. They don't have that document to show them now. And so by the state not having a risk assessment done, we now have still huge questions on what a worst case scenario is in the Straits of Mackinac. And so personally, I think that the state should take immediate action on Line 5 until they rectify this situation. A couple more points. We also talked about worst case scenario, and what Enbridge never talks about, which was referenced earlier, is there's 2 different products that run through Line 5. There's the light gas, or the light crude that runs through, and then the natural gas liquids that runs through. And we learned from a 1999 spill in Crystal Falls that when a leak happens of the natural liquid gas, it creates a plume. It is a gas that is heavier than air, and it creates a plume that does not disperse. When that happens, the only solution that Enbridge really has is to burn it and to get rid of it. So if there is a release in any location of the 2 different products, but in particular, if there's a release at the Straits of Mackinac and both products are released in the same incident, which happened in the Yellowstone spill that happened several years ago, 2 different products were released in the same spill. If that happens, there's a huge risk that nobody's talking about. They cannot really respond if there is a plume of gas hovering over the area. They have to address it. And not only is it a safety risk for the first responders, it's also a safety risk for the public. And so I do hope to interject that into the conversation moving forward. And that is how I will end it. Great. Thanks. Thanks so much. All right, we were hoping to be to the panel discussion by now, but I don't want to do that until I get, we change directions a little bit with our speakers. I think we've had great presentations so far that explain the risks. We're all scared, we're all angry about it. Now the question is, what do we do about it? And for that, we're going to turn to Representative Yusuf Rabi to give us kind of a legislative angle on Line 5 and maybe talk a little bit about how we can lobby our lawmakers, governor, et cetera. So if you wouldn't mind coming up and saying a few words about that, and then we'll switch to the panel. Oh, it is. Oh, okay.
Okay. Awesome. Well, hello everyone, and thank you so much for coming out today. This is a very important topic, obviously, one that everybody in this room cares deeply about, and I do as well. We're also joined by Senator Rick Jones, who's going to be addressing us in just a few minutes after I'm done. I thought he was going to go first, so thought I had a little bit more time, but looking forward to hearing what he has to say. He's been a great advocate on this issue, and I feel like every event that I go to about this, he's there too, because he's been doing some great work on the Senate side on the other side of the aisle and on the other side of the House, or on the other side of the chambers. But what I want to talk about today is just basically some of the work that I've been doing, some of the barriers that I've been running into, and some of the things that citizens around the state, I think, could be doing to help organize around this issue. So obviously we know about the problem with Line 5. We know that it's a concern for all of us. It's a threat to our Great Lakes. And I always go back to an experience that I had back in 2015. I see that Gail Steiner is here, former colleague from the Botanical Gardens and Arboretum. I was actually sent by the Botanical Gardens and Arboretum to a conference. That's where I worked before I came to the legislature. I was sent for a conference to California. And in California, I arrived in September. Well, 6 months earlier in May, one of their oil rigs, offshore oil rigs, had a spill. And oil had spilled from the rig and flowed onto the coast. Now, they had done some cleanup work, but again, it was 6 months later. And I remember going down to the beach to, check out the water because you're in California, why not go down to the beach? And being struck by the fact that there was still oil on the beach. There was still oil in the sand. I would look down and it would look like little black rocks, but it was actually oil. When you go down to pick it up, it's little oil beads in the sand. Not to mention the massive parts of the beach that were closed off, basically because, it was just big. It almost looked like pavement, but it was sand and beach debris all trapped in these big piles of black tar on the beach. So that's sort of the reference point for me. And then, obviously comparing that to the many fond memories that I have spending time on the beaches of the Great Lakes. Is that the legacy that we want to leave for our children? What kind of state do we want to leave behind? What state do we want to have for ourselves? Do we want to still be able to enjoy the Great Lakes and spend time on the beaches with our families? Or do we want to have to be cautious for when we're going to step on oil? Do we want to shut down entire beaches that we're not going to be able to use? So that's the framework for me, the personal framework. Legislatively, I introduced House Resolution 51, which calls on the governor and the attorney general to exercise their authority and shut down the easement of Line 5. That resolution was co-signed by 19 of my colleagues, including one Republican, who joined together to do that, to call on the governor about Line 5. Since then, there have been a lot of activities around House Resolution 51, people organizing, calling in to their representatives and senators to ask them to support that bill, or that resolution. And there have been lobby days as well. People have come to Lansing and met with, and I see some folks in the audience that were in Lansing lobbying, hundreds of people. So there's been a lot of great activity around House Resolution 51. And then Rick Jones is going to tell you about what he's doing on the Senate side, which is also really cool. But I also wanted to touch on a few other bills that I've introduced that I'm hoping will get some traction. They haven't been as publicized as House Resolution 51 has. But I recently introduced a bill as part of a pipeline safety package that would basically make it so that any pipeline company would be required to actually have a cleanup plan in place and to work with local authorities to make sure that a response plan was available. And part of that bill package actually requires that drills be done to actually show what a response plan would look like in the event of a spill. So not just saying we can respond in 8 minutes, but actually, just like a fire drill when you're in school, actually showing that it can be done. And so that's part of that bill. And again, that bill would also require a notification to the local authorities so that something like the Kalamazoo spill, in terms of the reporting, the line of reporting, it would be illegal to not report it directly to the Department of Environmental Quality and the federal government under that legislation. It was part of a bill package with a number of my other colleagues. One of the other bills would make the fine substantially higher for any pipeline company that did spill, a daily fine of $500,000, in addition to increasing other fines throughout that these companies could be fined with. So that was one of the bills. Then the other bill package is slightly on a different topic, but I think it's important for this group as well. We have an issue with the oil and gas extraction side as well. I mean, obviously, this is part of the equation. When oil and gas is extracted, a lot of methane is released into the atmosphere. Methane is the worst greenhouse gas and obviously is causing a lot of the global climate change that we're seeing these days. And I have a bill that would require any oil and gas operation that operates in the state of Michigan to have a methane recapture system so that none of that would be re-emitted into the atmosphere. As part of that bill package, there's also a bill that would require a public hearing in a community that an oil and gas well is going to be situated. Right now, there is no requirement for that. So an oil or gas well could situate in a community without the community having any input in that process directly. So this bill would actually require that a public hearing be held in the community where the oil and gas operation is going to be situated if that community requests it. And the third bill in that package makes it illegal to spread basically fracking waste onto roads, which is done as a dust control mechanism. So there's a lot of good stuff going on in Lansing right now. There's a lot of people, elected representatives and members of the public, fighting the good fight on these issues, trying to advocate for the Michigan that we all know is possible, right? A Michigan that values clean water and clean air, basic things that we need and rely on as human beings. And everybody in this room, I think, has an opportunity. Line 5 is a rallying call across this state. People in rural areas and urban areas alike are coming together around this issue. The barriers that are still in place to us getting real traction on this issue, number one is the issue of money and politics. Just like you see the oil sloshing around from Lake Michigan to Lake Huron, there's a lot of money sloshing around in Lansing too. There's been a money truck spill in Lansing, and it sloshes around from the two houses. So that's one of the major issues, and it's something that, I hate to say it, I see it every day. When I'm on the floor of the House, I'm asking people to co-sign my bills. People say, I'm not going to co-sign that because you know what? I get a lot of money from this or that or this entities. That's not acceptable. That's not how we should do politics. We need to address the issue of money and politics in this state and around this country. Two other quick points. I'm getting the time out, and I know I have to end here. But I do want to also say an issue that we need to talk about that hasn't been discussed yet. The two main concerns that I hear from people, pushback from people on Line 5, is number one, from people in the from representatives who serve the Upper Peninsula who say, well, my people rely on the natural gas from the pipeline. We need to have a credible response for those individuals to let them know that we're not going to take away their ability to heat their homes. And some of the things that were talked about earlier are alternatives that I think would work. But we need to make sure that we're having those conversations with our friends in the Upper Peninsula and engaging people in the Upper Peninsula to be advocates for this as well. Their voice, I think, in this is as important as everybody else's, if not more important right now. And the third thing that I want to mention, and the second point of pushback that I hear from people, is from workers. People who say, you're trying to take my job away. You're taking my job away because you're shutting this pipeline down. And so there are a number of jobs associated with this pipeline. And you know, unfortunately, a lot of times what we're seeing with issues like this and other environmental issues is corporations and you know, labor entities are sort of working hand in hand to push away environmental reforms that could make a real difference for our environmental health and welfare in the state. So we need to find a way to work with the workers, the labor community, to make sure that we're engaging them in this discussion and doing all of the things that we're talking about in a way that helps to empower people to continue to have good paying jobs in Michigan and supporting the folks in the labor community to make sure that, you know, they're part of this discussion as well. And I think if we can do those two things, and if we can work on the issue of money in politics, I think that we can make real progress on not only Line 5, but other environmental issues as well, like I talked about earlier. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and hand it over to my Senate colleague, who maybe there's a brief introduction in between, or I can just hand it straight off to him, however you want to do it. So with that, thank you all again for coming out, and Senator Rick Jones, everybody.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm a Republican from Grand Ledge. I tell you that so you know this is a bipartisan fight. Senator Margaret O'Brien is a huge supporter of my bill. I have support from Senator Schmidt up north, Senator Rock in Macomb County, all Republicans. This is not a Democrat or Republican issue. It is a human issue, and we've got to stop big oil. Here's the problem. Every senator and representative, they're told the Michigan Constitution requires you to do everything you can to protect the great resources of the state. But what's the number one resource? Number one resource are the Great Lakes, this beautiful, pure water. And some people don't take that real seriously. I do. So when I found out we had invasive species, I did everything I could to fight that. When I found out we had corporations that wanted giant floating fish farms, creating massive amounts of fish waste in a small area, creating algae blooms and all sorts of problems, I fought that. And then it was common sense to me that you don't have oil lines under Great Lakes water. It's just plain common sense. But here's what really brought it home to me. I grew up down in Battle Creek. My mother-in-law lived in Marshall, Michigan. That pipeline broke, and she had to sell her house. She was an elderly woman. Now, she wasn't right on the river. She was a moderate income, so she was across the roadway in a moderate home. And fortunately, she was elderly, and she accepted it. But it could have been some young person's dream home that they had to sell. So she had to sell out to Enbridge and move on to a senior home. And that shouldn't happen in this state. It shouldn't happen because they promise us everything is right. Well, it's not if the line is going to break, it's when. It's going to happen. Now, there's three legs of the stool that hold up the state of Michigan: manufacturing, agriculture, and tourism. Now, what is that going to do to the pure Michigan image? How much tourism are we going to lose when this thing breaks? $7 billion come in from fishing, if you count all the money that's made by Canada and all the states and Michigan around the Great Lakes. That's going to be harmed. And what about the 40 million people that drink the water? 40 million. Remember that number. And we're going to be adding, Genesee County is going to hook up to Huron. Ottawa County is probably going to have to hook up to Lake Michigan because some of their wells are starting to draw salt. And so this is our resource. This is our drinking water. We can't play games with a 64-year-old pipeline. It's going to break sooner or later. They should immediately make plans to reroute it. Well, I wrote a Senate bill, this year it's 292. I had it in last session. And what that bill does is it says that the pipeline must be inspected by outside authority, and if there's any defect at all reported, that Michigan shall and will shut it down, and no more pipelines will ever be allowed under Great Lakes water, period. Period. Now, last term, when I put that in, one day after I had that in, Enbridge flew in. They flew lobbyists in from Texas and Canada and everywhere. They're in my office screaming and hollering at me, and all of the myths that they sell, oh, it's going to drive gasoline prices up in Michigan. You know, we're going to lose a lot of oil that we send down to the Detroit refinery. Of course, you know, they don't like to tell you that most of it goes to Sarnia, and it's simply Canadian oil taking a shortcut through our Great Lakes, which makes no sense at all. Now, they got the Yoopers on their side. They've convinced the Yoopers you're going to lose jobs, you aren't going to have any propane to heat your homes. Baloney. Baloney. And I can tell you that he's right, that the minute they left my office, they were going around, and I'm not saying anything illegal was done. It's legal to have a PAC and make contributions, but I heard the money flowed. And the only way we can beat a big oil company is to bring on the pressure. They asked me to speak real briefly. What can you do? Contact not just your representatives and your senators in the state, but contact them at the national level, your congressmen, your senators, and tell them you want it stopped. You want the Great Lakes protected. This isn't something we can gamble with. This is the future for our children. This oil spill will really harm us, so let's all stick together. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I want to invite our panelists to take a seat at the table, and you guys will have to share a mic, unfortunately. But hopefully this will work out.
Let me grab my pen.
Oh, sure.
Sorry.
And then I wanted to thank everybody who's submitted questions. We'll try to get through as many as we can. I think we can go a little bit past 8:30, so we'll see what we can get through here. Okay, so the first question is directed primarily at Sean, but again, if anybody else has a compelling opinion about it, feel free to weigh in. So the question is, does Enbridge have a fund set aside to pay damages to those harmed?
Quick answer.
Would you repeat the question a little slower?
Okay, sorry. Does Enbridge have a fund set aside to pay damages to those who have been harmed?
Quick answer is no. They have an insurance policy with the state that is wholly insufficient for funding what would be the largest disaster in the history of the Great Lakes.
Okay.
I think their insurance policy for the Kalamazoo River spill was $860. I want to say $860 million.
Well, okay. And okay. And the cost?
The cost was over $1 billion.
Yeah. Okay.
And that they do not cover the home buyout. They don't cover the fines and penalties and everything else.
Okay. Let's move on to the next question. Again, I want to get through as many as we can. I'll direct this one first to Representative Robbie and Senator Jones. I've heard a proposal to put something on the ballot that will stop the oil but leave the line to use natural gas and propane. Do you know anything about the group Keep Our Lakes Great, and what is your opinion on this ballot initiative? Actually, I'll just open that up to everybody, but I don't know. One of the legislators want to start?
It sounds like a good proposal. I would support it. There's no reason why the propane can't keep going to the UP. They just don't need to cross the straits with the oil.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess for me, I've read the proposal. It's long. There's a lot of parts to it. I think it's a step in the right direction, and I think it's, shutting down the oil part of the pipeline. I think that's the most damaging part. I don't think it's perfect, but I think it's a step in the right direction. You guys have any thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. Glad we were able to address this question a little bit. Clean Water Action has chosen to not support this ballot initiative because, first of all, our primary goal is decommissioning Line 5, and this falls short of that. Second, it likely violates federal law and could be held up in court for a long time. And third, Representative Robbie, I'm glad you brought up earlier money in politics. Frankly, there is no money on the environmental movement that can fight an oil company at the ballot right now in Michigan.
One thing that I wanted to say, but I didn't say it earlier, but I'll say it now, is when you see the flow of money in Lansing, the groups that have money are usually, the corporate interests, things like that. The groups that don't usually have money to do similar things are the environmental groups, those types of organizations. So, I don't know if I can say this at a League of Women Voters thing, but I almost instead of donating to the Sierra Club as an organization, donate to their PAC, because that helps them to do more work politically. And the only, right now, if we're not going to change the laws around money in politics, then maybe your dollar can go one step closer to helping that organization, be a more impactful advocate in the government process. So that's my quick 2 cents on that.
Okay. I have a question for Dave, Dr. Schwab. Do the currents travel at different velocities throughout the water column, i.e. faster at the bottom than the surface? If so, how would this impact the detection and cleanup of a spill?
That's a really good question.
It's on. You're good.
Okay. It turns out that during the summer, the flow can be in different directions at different levels in the water column. And during the winter, it's mostly in the same direction from top to bottom. And it's almost as strong at the bottom as it is at the surface. So the question was about impact on an oil spill?
On the ability to detect an oil spill?
I don't think the detection of an oil spill there is going to come from observation. It's going to probably come first from a drop in pressure in their line. If it is detected by somebody seeing it, it's going to be already too late for anything.
Yeah.
One of the horrible lessons learned in the Kalamazoo River spill is that the diluted bitumen separates when it starts to enter the environment, it weathers, and the heavy bitumen sinks. This was learned the hard way. I think there was actually a responder who was in the river. They were in an area they thought was relatively clean, and he put his foot in the water and saw sheen surface further down, and they came to the horrible realization that there was a ton of oil underneath the surface traveling very quickly, and then they thought they stopped it before Morrow Lake, and that ended up being in Morrow Lake substantially. But what's important about this is that the EPA at that time, their precursor for oil being in the area was surface sheen. That's really their only indicator. And they learned that they needed to be a little bit more strategic in how they addressed the oil. Now, the Kalamazoo River was a very closed environment. They could get in and they could look at the sediment, they could stir it up, they could see surface sheen, they knew they needed to get into that area and clean it up. But if you're considering a location like the Straits of Mackinac, there's always going to be weathering with oil. There's going to be an amount of oil that doesn't come to the surface. How are we preparing to manage and detect that? Because currently, we do not have those parameters in place. And the oil companies definitely are not thinking about them, but are our first responders.
Okay, great. Thanks, Beth. I have a question here that's probably best directed towards Senator Jones or Representative Robbie. What does the state get from Enbridge in exchange for letting them put pipelines in the state of the lakes, in the straits of the lakes?
I'm trying to recall the figure. I think it was something like $5,000. 64 years ago, it was a minor licensing fee. Now the state and the counties where it runs through now are going to get tax dollars. And then, of course, you got people that say we got jobs that we don't want to go away, the pipe fitter people.
Okay. Along a related question here, is it true that the only part of the Michigan pipeline system that the state has jurisdiction over is Pipeline 5 in the Straits? I'll open that up to, maybe Beth wants to.
Yes, so Line 5 is a transmission pipeline that has both state and international boundaries, and so it's federally regulated by the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, which is PHMSA for short, and that's under the Department of Transportation. And how these pipelines are regulated is that there's an integrity management program that pipeline operators have to follow. And if a pipeline is within a high consequence area or an unusually sensitive area, so this means a lake, near a lake, a wetland, school, high population, then they have to inspect the pipeline within integrity management every 5 years, and they have to report those inspections. They have to address anomalies. If it does not fall in those locations, then it is not under the integrity management program, and it never technically has to be inspected. Our senators have actually tried to push to make all of the pipelines in the Great Lakes under the unusually sensitive and high consequence area classification, so all of them have to be inspected all of the time. The problem is that the federal agency is very much hands-off, so pipeline operators do their own inspections, run their own analysis, and run it up the federal chain. And so the federal agencies are basically just having the operators check some boxes. They're not actually doing the inspections, and so it's a self-reporting system. Not only that, it's a revolving door. Because of this industry is so close, a lot of the folks who once worked for oil pipelines now work within the regulatory system or vice versa. And it's always changing. In fact, the head of PHMSA at the time of the 2000 spill was an ex-lawyer of Enbridge. And so that shows you how intertwined this federal agency can become. At the last advisory board meeting, the state actually discussed if they should take over some jurisdiction of federal pipelines, and so that is up for discussion.
Interesting. I have a question for Sean. How has oil and water don't mix worked with tribal communities that may be affected?
Yeah, it's a great question. We've been working with, I believe we have so far 15 different federally recognized tribal organizations involved in the Oil and Water Don't Mix campaign. And they have a very active role because there are certain rights that the tribes have up north where they've actually been able to push a little bit more than we can on different issues. For instance, currently Enbridge has a request out to put in 22 additional anchor points across Line 5 through the Straits. And since it is in tribal fishing territory, they are actually getting a consultation between the tribes and Enbridge about it, whereas that's something that the general public can't call for. So we've been working a lot with the tribal communities up north, and that's where a lot of great support for shutting down this pipeline is coming from, actually. They did, the last time we had a Pipeline Safety Advisory Board in Lansing, they sent 2 full buses down from Traverse City.
All right.
It is also, there is a tribe that's in Wisconsin that has a piece or a section of Line 5 running on their reservation, and they were very smart, and when that pipeline went in, they had an expiration date on the lease. That tribe has made the decision that the pipeline threatens their natural resource to the extent that they do not want to renew the lease, and so they have already passed a resolution within the tribe to not renew the lease. It's currently in violation, and they're working through the legal channels to shut down Line 5 on their reservation.
Good. Good. Another question for Dave. Are there estimates of the cost of cleaning up a spill spread across 700 miles of shoreline?
That's easy. No. No, and it's hard to, for me to describe that 700 miles in the correct way. There's 700 miles that are vulnerable to an oil spill. Not every spill would affect 700 miles. In fact, no one spill would affect 700 miles. But a spill in my simulation affected one part of that 700 miles. So I think the most shoreline that was affected by a single spill was on the order of 100 miles, something like that. But nonetheless, the costs for cleanup, that would be part of this risk analysis that the state is trying to get accomplished if we can get through the conflict of interest problems. And that's where people take these simulations that I did, look at the value of shoreline, look at the type of shoreline. From what I understand, it's the not the sand that's the biggest problem. It's large boulders, riprap, that is very common up there. Mm-hmm. Once oil gets into that riprap, you can't get it out. There's no way to suck it out of there. Sand, you can filter or do something with it to get the oil out. Once it gets in these big boulders, short of removing the entire riprap, you can't get it out. So we're in trouble, I think, there if there is a spill up there.
Let me compound that trouble with a follow-up question. If there is a spill, who would pay for the cleanup? And this is for anybody who wants to answer, not necessarily Dave.
So Enbridge was required to pay for all of the cleanup with the Kalamazoo River spill. However, our agencies, both federal, state, and very local, learned the hard way that they have no way of having enough resources for this kind of disaster, or for that kind of disaster. And the reimbursement process was insufficient at first. To my knowledge, they have reimbursed most of the cost, if not all of the cost, back to all of the agencies that were directly involved. However, I have to say, Enbridge was being watched very closely with this spill, and they would be with Line 5. Most operators and spills like this, it does not go the way that it went in the Kalamazoo River, and there's usually a much more contentious process to get reimbursement from the agencies that are involved. But Enbridge did pay them all and reimbursed them all.
I would just add that one of the costs that's not reimbursable by the company is all the lost business, like, so if the Line 5 were to rupture, lost tourism dollars, lost fishing dollars, lost agricultural dollars, lost economic potential, and where does that money go?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and on that point, the river was closed for 3 years altogether. 5 years, sections were closed. This is a no contact. You cannot come into contact with it. So consider height of tourism. You're on Mackinac Island. You're stranded. No ferries are allowed to run. The only option is to fly people out. This kind of that's that's a cost to the businesses in those locations that they don't get reimbursed for. There's so many different applications. In fact, one of the homeowners that I mentioned who was going through cancer treatment at the time of the spill, she owned a business right along the same part of the river, and it was really hard for her to get her business to be part of the buyout program because Enbridge fought back on having to reimburse businesses. It ultimately ended up being the case, but it took a lot of her resources and time and energy to get that to be the case.
Okay, I'm going to make this the last question, and I'm going to direct it to the legislators. First, what is Canada's response to the debate around Line 5? Have you guys had any interaction with Canadian counterparts?
I believe that Canada supports their company. They want to keep the line in place. They want to keep Sarnia working, and they don't want to construct the oil line through Ontario where it should be and not through our water.
Yeah, just to echo that, I mean, I know Canada is very pro-oil generally as a country, and Justin Trudeau and his infinite progressiveness is also pro-oil, and supports, you know, all of the oil operations that are going on in Canada and all the piping of oil and all the processing of oil. So I don't know that we're going to get much cooperation from the Canadian side on this issue, unfortunately.
Okay. Does anybody else want to weigh in?
The International Joint Commission has looked at this, and that's there's an agreement between the U.S. and Canada. There's 3 representatives from Canada and 3 representatives from the U.S., and they have started to explore pipelines and oil in the Great Lakes, but they have not taken a firm position on Line 5 directly.
Okay. Technically, we need to be out of this room in 5 minutes, so I want to say thanks to everyone for submitting your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. They were all really compelling. And I wanted to especially thank all of our speakers for donating a night of their life to inform us about this issue. So thank you very much.
I just also want to thank, what an excellent group of speakers. I learned so much, and it's a real call to action. So it's talking to your friends, talking to your neighbors, writing letters, making phone calls. It all helps. So it also makes you feel like you're doing something, and that's the only way we're going to get results. So thank you very much, and thank you for our committee did a great job putting this together. So thank you, and thanks for coming.